Hi, good evening, all of you. Welcome to this very interesting webinar that we are doing today on ecosystems. I have three special guests today with us. We have Stuart Trainer, Sangeet Paul, and Annika Steiber. Uh, all three great professionals. In fact, I would just do a very quick introduction. So Stuart Trainer, my friend for over a decade. He's a management journalist, business theorist, and he's the
Hi,
founder of
good
Thinkers
evening,
50.
all of you. Welcome to this very interesting.
And the founder of Thinkers 50, which is like the Oscars of management thinking. If somebody is at the helm of the top management thinking in the world, then it has to be Stuart Krainer. So he can claim to be somebody who identifies the best of thinking and the best of ideas in the world, and he's been doing it for a couple of decades. So Stuart, thanks a lot for joining us today. Sangeet, again, a thorough professional who has actually what I call done a lot of work on platforms and ecosystems, has done two books on platform revolution and platform scale, founder of Platformation Labs, but most interestingly, he has published significantly with HBR and so on and so forth. In fact, one of his pieces was amongst the top 10 reads for the year by HBR as well. So Sangeet, thanks a lot for joining us. Annika, again, from the Bay Area, uh, has done four books, which I find are absolutely amazing. Something on the Silicon Valley model, the Google model, management for the digital age, and metaverse. And Annika has been recognized for her work quite a bit. So that's where it is. So we'll quickly dive into the conversation because we have a 1 hour frame for this conversation. So Sangeet, I would like to come to you first to really understand from you as to what do you think about the idea of ecosystems? What are ecosystems? And how do you really integrate it with the idea of platforms?
Sure. So in a world that is rapidly becoming more digitized and more connected, we are the idea of ecosystems become important. Ecosystems are essentially systems of interconnected firms that coordinate their activity towards a common business outcome. And while on the face of it, that sounds like a very simple, straightforward definition, what's important over here is the mechanism of coordination. Because traditionally, firms used to be vertically integrated. So you had all functions needed to create final business output inside a single firm. But as digital technologies proliferate, transaction costs fall down, the cost of coordinating activities go down. And so all the activities no longer have to be inside the firm. And so these activities can now be better coordinated in ecosystems of interconnected firms. Now, what's important over here, as I mentioned, is how do you coordinate these activities together? Because in the past, inside a firm, you had a command and control hierarchy as a mechanism to coordinate. In an ecosystem, you coordinate through a variety of mechanisms. I'll just mention two or three of these. The simplest mechanism could be contracts. You could have just a very sophisticated network of contracts between different firms. Something that's a lot more scalable is the idea of standards. You have ecosystems that have developed around standards. For example, you had the CD standard or the DVD standard, around which you had creative industries, electronics manufacturers, and CD or DVD manufacturers all coordinating their activities together in an ecosystem. But what we're now seeing as one of the most sophisticated ways of coordinating ecosystems is the idea of a platform. A platform fundamentally provides a plug and play infrastructure into which other firms can plug in, and it governs their interactions. Now, all of these contracts, standards, platforms, all of these fundamentally govern interactions. But what makes platforms different is first that it provides this single common infrastructure where a range of firms can plug in, and it's able to expand its ability to coordinate across them by using data, by using scalable technology. And in doing so, it allows these firms to create complementary value through which the entire ecosystem then benefits. And so that is what's key about a platform as the mechanism of coordinating an ecosystem. When we think about platforms, we have many different examples. We have the usual suspects like Amazon in retail or logistics, or Google in the information industry, Facebook in communication services. But all of these fundamentally provide an infrastructure and a governance mechanism. And as firms start coalescing around them, these platforms benefit from economies of scope because they're able to coordinate across a large variety of firms. And they benefit from the idea of network effects, that the more firms produce value which is complementary to the platform, the more other firms want to come in and consume value from this platform. And through that, the entire ecosystem gets coordinated further. If I take a couple of other examples to help make sense of this, we're seeing ecosystems, for example, emerge in logistics and the shipping industry, where traditionally you had firms working in silos, and so it was very difficult to see the life cycle of a shipment from origin to destination, because the data for this would work across many different firms, and all of these firms would work in silos. Today, these firms are beginning to work in ecosystems. They're using distributed ledger technologies to share data. And so blockchain and distributed ledger technologies, for example, create another form of coordination mechanism by which these firms can share their information and coordinate their activities better. And as the final example, I'd say we're seeing this in heavy industry as well, where with the rise of the Internet of Things, machines are becoming digitized, and we're seeing the creation of digital twins of machines. Now, left to itself, the idea of a digital twin of a machine just gives basic use cases around predictive maintenance, around determining the operational condition of a machine. But if you think of these machines as participating as part of a larger production process, and if you can have a platform stitch that together using data from different machines, you now have a digitized process. Once you have a digitized process, it can interact with a digitized logistics system. It can interact furthermore with the entire supply chain. And through that, you go from the micro of getting machine data, viewing process inside a particular firm, to coordinating all of that across multiple firms in an ecosystem. So we're beginning to see wherever digitization comes in, wherever deregulation happens that allows new ways to unbundle value, we start seeing the rise of ecosystems in those industries.
Sangeet, this is fascinating. In fact, the last point that you said, that you are actually going to have IoT. And when you talk about Internet of Things, and there is going to be that integration in terms of, say, production processes to information sharing. But if I ask you a very interesting question in terms of saying, what do you think is the world of tomorrow? Where do you think these ecosystems will go, especially through IoT? Would it be just way too connected, we lose our privacy, and so on and so forth? Or is it going to be a more democratic process?
Well, so I have a certain view on that, which is actually the current thesis of my work, and that is that as we move further and further into ecosystems, we very often we associate the term collaboration with ecosystems. Now, collaboration is a central part of ecosystems, but collaboration is a means for a new form of competition. And what happens as a result of this competition is that value in ecosystems primarily accumulates at two layers. The first layer is the layer at which demand is aggregated. Whether in a B2C ecosystem, that could be consumer demand, so think of Facebook, Amazon, Google, and so on, Netflix. But in a B2B ecosystem, this could be different layers of demand inside, that the B2B ecosystem is serving. Whoever aggregates the demand ends up controlling a lot of value. A second position at which a lot of value gets aggregated is at the level of the infrastructure on which this ecosystem sits. This infrastructure could take a variety of different forms. It could be cloud computing coupled with machine learning, which is what Amazon and Microsoft, for example, are providing to a huge range of industries. This infrastructure could be something like an electronic health record, which a company like Epic tries to control. Whoever controls demand aggregation and industry infrastructure ends up controlling most of the value. So what we will start seeing is we're going to start seeing a lot of polarization of value in these two directions, and a relative commoditization in between, because a central law of technology ecosystems is that you succeed competitively by commoditizing what is complementary to you. So think of Apple. Apple's iPhone becomes more valuable by commoditizing the application. If the application was very expensive, your value of buying the iPhone would go down. So the fact that the application is commoditized to 99 cents makes the usage of the iPhone more valuable for you, or the ownership of the iPhone more valuable for you. And so the same model works out in across many other examples. And as we see more value moving towards those who aggregate the demand and those who create these infrastructures, anything that is complementary to these, which are all other firms that are working alongside them in the ecosystem, they increasingly get commoditized. And we've seen this happen in retail with Amazon commoditizing merchants. We're seeing this happen in healthcare now with platforms taking up, using AI taking up a doctor's task increasingly. So we're going to see that happen more. So going back to your question about privacy, I would say there are two aspects that we need to think about. One is, what does this mean for the future of work in a world where our access to the market is managed by large demand coordinators, and where the backend infrastructure of work is managed by a few companies? Do we become increasingly commodified? Do we become like the drivers on Uber who cannot set their price and who can easily be substituted? That's one piece. The second piece is, where do we go from the perspective of data as an asset? Because all of these firms succeed in an ecosystem play because coordination requires data. And that data eventually comes from us, comes from activities that we engage in. So if data is so central to coordinating ecosystems, how do we ensure future innovation in ecosystems while managing privacy? Those would be some of the key questions we need to think through as we move forward.
Thanks, Sangeet. I'll get back to you on this, like some very profound answers. But Stuart, I have to get to you here. What do you think? Sangeet has said he's created a vast expanse of what he means by ecosystems, the challenges that we are actually facing. Stuart, what do you think are ecosystems? How do you think they're going to change the world? How are we going to be really facing the challenges of tomorrow and resolving, say, the crisis that the world faces in many ways?
Thank you, Amit, for handing over and suggesting there's a crisis in the world. I think what we've got, I think it's worth looking back about where we come from on this organizationally and managerially. If we look back over the organizations over the last 100 or so years, they've been linear, one-dimensional in their perspective on the world. You think back to Ford and the advent of the mass production line at the beginning of the 20th century. I think he opened his Highland Park factory in 1910, and that produced 13 million Model Ts between 1910 and 1927. Ford eventually had 48% of the car market, and then he built an even bigger plant at River Rouge, which was 2 miles wide and 1 mile long, and employed 81,000 people. And then Ford got into vertical integration. He bought 15 coal mines. He bought iron ore. He had freighters going up the Great Lakes, all in the cause of vertical integration. Then eventually he bought a large swathe of Brazil to extract rubber from it. So he had control. And all of this, all these activities, that was the fundamental business model of the 20th century. And it's built on, as Sangeet said, command and control. It was linear and one-dimensional. In the 21st century, the organizational dynamics are radically different. The new reality is messy and uncertain. I think the uncertain element, I think we probably overplay. I mean, things have always been uncertain, but organizations now sprawl globally. They compete in fast changing markets against equally fast changing competitors. They compete for people, they compete for customers, and their suppliers are dispersed worldwide. So any feeling of control is illusory. So think of the impact of the pandemic on the world. And John Hagel has talked about companies in the past looked for scalable efficiency, and now they need to master scalable learning. And I see ecosystems as part of that process of getting to scalable learning. And it's a much more ambiguous but potentially productive relationship. And I think the relationship is actually the key word. Ecosystems are about relationships with employees, relationships with suppliers, relationships with customers. And actually organizations and managers haven't been very good at relationships in the past. Command and control doesn't rely on relationships. So I think it's a question of relationship building. The Oxford English Dictionary defines an ecosystem as a biological system composed of all the organisms found in a particular physical environment interacting with it and each other. And I think the crucial words here are interaction, complexity, and system. And I think that's actually what puts people off ecosystems. The words complexity and systems are a bit daunting. But I think ecosystems plainly already exist. If you look at Silicon Valley is successful because of the ecosystems which exist in the valley. If you look back 40 or 50 years, the dominant geographical area for technology in America was the East Coast, not the West Coast. The East Coast and Route 128 around Massachusetts. But what that didn't have was an ecosystem. Silicon Valley has got an ecosystem of finance, an ecosystem of education around Stanford and other institutions such as Anika's, and an ecosystem, a social ecosystem. So ecosystems exist already. So I don't think they're as daunting as people might think. They are around us, and they are the root of success for corporations and for entire regions. After all, West Coast Americans don't have a monopoly of wisdom on technology. Look at the work of Navi Raju on frugal innovation in India and elsewhere. The ability to innovate and come up with bright ideas is universal. But Silicon Valley does have a fantastic ecosystem, and that is the differentiator. So what we're seeing now is the notion of ecosystems being more broadly understood and applied by a small number of organizations. What's interesting, if a company like Tesla actually doesn't appear to be going down the ecosystem route. It's building bigger and bigger factories. Its latest factory in Fremont, California is a bit like one of Henry Ford's factories. It employs more than 10,000 people, 5.3 million square feet. So it's interesting that approach still carries on. But I think in the age of additive manufacturing, in the age where we talk about agile organizations and lean organizations, ecosystems are certainly going to become more important in the years to come. As a McKinsey report suggests that by 2025, more than 100 industries and value chains will have collapsed to 12 or so ecosystems with over $60 trillion worth of revenues. So I think there's an interesting issue here in that ecosystems seem to me to be more kind of freewheeling and agile. But at the same time, as Sangeet says, we're actually seeing the concentration of power and money to some extent on those platforms and the associated ecosystems. So it's a very interesting stage. I noticed one of the first questions that came in was that, can ecosystems be self-governed? And I think they can if you allow them. But the history I've just talked about suggests that organizations and managers won't be very keen on allowing ecosystems to be self-governed. So I think that the governance of ecosystems and how much control governments and corporations seek to have on them will become a huge issue. To some extent, the governance of technology, i.e. privacy and elements like that around Facebook, etc., is a bit of a side issue, because the governance of the ecosystems is probably even more important and will become an important issue in the next few decades, I think.
Stuart, this is fascinating, but I have to ask, you did allude to a very interesting idea on economic geography. And there is this whole huge view of clusters and agglomeration of firms and things. How do you think it is going to be, how ecosystems are going to be different from the idea of agglomeration of firms or clusters? How would you really react to that question?
I think country after country has tried to create clusters of usually technology-led firms, and mostly unsuccessfully. I mean, there's a host of examples in Europe of where they've, and America, where they've built they've given land to lots of companies to build their factories there in the hope that there'll be some sort of shared knowledge. But I don't really think it can be artificially created. There are elements to it. I mean, we do work in Denmark with the city of Odense, and they're doing lots of sensible things. They've got the technology. It's the third biggest robotics cluster in the world. They've got the University of Southern Denmark. But the rest of the ecosystem, these things do occur naturally, and it's difficult to create them from scratch. I think it's a challenge.
Well, thanks, Stuart. Like Annika, I would like to get you here into the conversation. In fact, Stuart did talk about the Silicon Valley, and you've actually had some significant work in that area. You have started organizations there. You have started the Silicon Valley itself. How do you really look at this idea of ecosystems, Silicon Valley, how firms are actually operating there, the idea of, say, what Google is, or what is it, a platform, ecosystem, or an ecosystem? How do you really look at it? Annika.
Absolutely. I would love to share that. So I represent the Renan Hui Silicon Valley Center. And so we focus on the new principle of the 21st century management overall, and try to codify that, which is it's a challenge because nobody really knows and have a clear map of what that is yet. One of the factors, one of the new principle is for sure the factor of ecosystem. And I think when you discuss ecosystem, we already heard a number of comments here that should be highlighted. We should remember, I think, firstly, that we have companies always been working with partners, right? So it's nothing really new. But we have come from concept like alliances and partners to this new concept of ecosystem. I think one of the drivers there is, if we think about the digitalization and digitization of processes, is the factor of new technology that can make ecosystem at scale in a hugely different way. So we talk about the internet technology, the technology of blockchain and smart contracts. But we also see, I would say very much in Silicon Valley, but also all over the world, new ways of working for big companies that is also making ecosystem more relevant to discuss. And that is working with startups. That wasn't maybe the traditional way of partners before. I think to go back to both Sanjeet and to Stuart's comments here, what we see in Silicon Valley is maybe more what Sanjeet is focusing on, ecosystem or platform as a business model, where it's important to position yourself as maybe the one or two of the leaders in that new business model. But if you go to Europe and European companies, I would say they maybe work more in a context which Stuart mentioned before, where you find ecosystem as a coalition of new partners, for example, startups, and where you use maybe not a platform, you use an incubator or a physical space where you work together. And that is also called ecosystem, but it would be more close to an innovation ecosystem where the big corporations are maybe not trying to become a platform business, but they try to use startups in order to innovate and become more agile and faster in their innovation processes, but also to help them to transform themselves, because the startup can access and help them access new digital innovation ecosystem. So I think it's important to know what we discuss. So I think when you do discuss ecosystem, it's important to discuss at least two dimensions here. What is the purpose with the ecosystem? Is it to create the platform, the new business model, and take that position Or is it that you use an ecosystem of, say, startups and big corporations in order to drive transformation or to drive innovation for the big corporation, or scale the startups, which is more maybe common in Europe. And the other dimension would be the digitization of those. Many of the ecosystem we have been looking at in Europe is more of geographical proximity. They're trying to have them closer together and get serendipity effects, while the platform business model would be needing the digitization and digital technology, and where you optimize that to maximize your position in that ecosystem.
Sorry. And so quite fascinating, Annika, but just pushing ahead on your thoughts. When you really look at an enterprise like, say, Google or Amazon, what do you think of them? Like, of course, what Sangeet was alluding to was that, of course, Apple wants an ecosystem, and he wants, and their applications are the ecosystem part of it, and so on and so forth. How do you really look at enterprises like Googles and Amazons of the world?
That is a very good question. I mean, they are definitely and have been the forefronter in this new business model. And they are definitely very successful in that. I do see that it might be a limited number of players that can take that role. So I do agree with that. The risk is that if you want to play in that business model, there's a lot of players that will be potentially commodities, and will be taking more of a provider role, but not the dominant player role. And I also think that with the online and with digitization, a lot of industries are going to get some dominant player with that ecosystem. But in the same time, and here I would like Sangeet's input, you have hardware manufacturing services, you have industries where that platform model might be less natural, where it would be harder for them to transform their current business model into become a next Google. So it might be that this business model that we see Amazon, Google is one of them. And then when we discuss ecosystem, it might be, a use of ecosystem in another perspective for industries where the platform model might be less of a true scenario. But I would love to see what Sangeet is commenting on that. If you are, for example, a robotic company like ABB today, or a life science company, do you see that they would become a platform company like Google or Amazon, or do you see other models there?
So, Sangeet, you have the next question. So what do you think?
Sure. Yeah, that's a very interesting point that Annika's brought up over there. What we need to understand is that, as Annika was saying, ecosystems can take on various different shapes, and what really defines what an ecosystem, how the ecosystem is structured, is primarily two things. What is the job to be done at the end of the ecosystem, and what is the nature of interaction that best enables coordination towards that job to be done? So if I just take a few examples, Silicon Valley as an ecosystem, the job to be done is to create the most innovative firms. That's different from the job to be done on Amazon or Google, which is to create the best consumer experience, which is different from the job to be done in an innovation ecosystem, which is to provide the best innovation to the consuming enterprise. Now, if we think of that, when we move towards a lot of these industries, which are which are more heavy industry, which are the kinds of industries that Annika was talking about, there are two important pieces to think about over here. How does the job to be done change? And how does the mechanism of interaction and coordination change? The first piece is that the job to be done changes because demand in a consumer industry like commerce, communication, or information services is very homogeneous. It's a Google search in Brazil is a Google search in India. Buying a shirt in Brazil is buying a shirt in India. It's very homogeneous globally if you look at those things. When you think about industrial ecosystems, demand is very heterogeneous. How you think about construction for a stadium is very different. In a country which has a marshy land is very different from how you think about construction of a defense facility in a country which has a lot of lack of land and transport infrastructure. So if we just stick with that example, the demand becomes heterogeneous, the regulatory landscape. So because the job to be done is heterogeneous, the nature of interaction is also heterogeneous because of a different regulatory landscape, a different way in which data can be handled, a different level to which digitization has been allowed. Because of those things, we won't see the Google, Facebook, Amazon model in these industries, largely because the fundamental two defining factors that shape the architecture of ecosystems are changing. And so what we are likely to see more in these cases is we're going to see coordination mechanisms or platforms for that, platforms that emerge in the space to be more focused on providing common standards and common intelligence for various actors to make better decisions. And so we will still see some level of polarization, but it will happen because not because you control the access to the consumer the way Google, Facebook, Amazon do, but because you define the standard for the industry and you control the intelligence that allows companies to best work along that standard. So let me take a couple of examples to make this real. In the construction industry, ABB, the example that was taken, or just think of construction in general, you have a company like Autodesk, which has a position to create a dominant platform in a platform-based ecosystem in construction, because Autodesk's design software is used for building design across a whole range of scenarios. And once you have a digitized model of a building, you can run simulations. Once you run simulations, you can determine what kind of materials can go into the building in the construction phase. So then you can move from design to coordinating the construction ecosystem of contractors and various workers. And then from there, if you integrate into an ABB or a Rockwell or a Johnson Controls and get into their building management systems, you can then get into the operations phase as well. So that's how an ecosystem would look in that model. It would not be as holistic winner take all as Google or an Amazon is, but it would be more in this format where you're defining the standards through the building design model. And then by virtue of all the building simulations running on your platform, you're centralizing the intelligence at a global level. If I take another example, if you look at Alibaba, it has a very Google, Amazon style ecosystem in China, but when it's going global, Ant Financial, its financial services arm that's now up for IPO, as it goes global, it's taking more of a different model where it's investing in banks and payment companies in individual countries, and it's providing a common backend for all of these. So if Alibaba invests in a payments company, the payment company has to shift to the Alibaba cloud, which then means that at the backend, there's a common standard, there's a common set of risk mitigation algorithms, a common set of credit scoring algorithms informing all of this. So through that, Alibaba is creating a global ecosystem, but it's doing that through standards and intelligence, not by creating network effects at the front end. So I think that's one of the key differences that we're going to see. And it all comes back from first principles, back to what's the job to be done? How does that change? What's the nature of the nature of coordination or the variable of interaction? How does that change? It all comes down to that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sangeet. Stuart, I have to really ask you a question. Like Sangeet did talk about Alibaba. You have worked with one significant enterprise out of China that is Hired, and where you have actually talked about ecosystems, Internet of Things, Rendenyahi as a model. How do you think this really fits into this idea of ecosystems and platforms? And because Hire is somebody which has done some significant innovation in terms of becoming one of the largest enterprises, white goods manufacturers in the world. And it actually has a very huge entrepreneurial thinking in terms of how they operate. So are they a set of micro enterprises, or is it an ecosystem in itself? Where is it? What is it that we can draw from that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to go back to one of Annika's points about the startup companies, and I think the entire question of ecosystems changes how big companies relate to smaller companies. And I think that's going to be a central issue, because you look at some of the big tech companies in Silicon Valley, their relationships with smaller tech companies are usually they see somebody doing something smart and they acquire them. And you would think that the wisdom and insights of the company being acquired will be kind of assimilated into the big corporation, but in fact that's not actually what happens. What happens is they buy the company and the smart people leave as soon as they can, because they can't see a role for themselves in large organization. So I think the relationship between large companies and how they can partner with smaller companies is an issue that ecosystems potentially answers, as long as they can develop purposeful relationships rather than simply acquiring smaller companies. Which brings me to the point you were raising, Amit, about Hire. And what's interesting about Hire, as Amit says, Hire is now the biggest white goods manufacturer in the world. I mean, it's come from nowhere over the last 40 years. It bought GE Appliances 3 years ago for $5 billion. So it's a really significant company. And what it's done is incredible in terms of management and innovation. As Amit alluded to, it's got a management philosophy called Ren Den Hai. And Ren Den Hai in Mandarin is a kind of fusion of employee, customer, and value. And Hire talks about zero distance to the customer, bridging the gap between the employees and customers. And to achieve that, it's created, the people within Hire have a huge amount of freedom to create their own spin-off businesses. They've got bright ideas. They only need 2 or 3 people in the company to agree to it, and they can create a spin-off business. And these are called micro enterprises. And they've created thousands of micro enterprises. I mean, the failure rate in the micro enterprises is as high as startups everywhere around the world. So it's not an easy solution, but it enables employees to act like entrepreneurs. And it creates, I mean, what's interesting about what Hire has done, it's trying to create galaxies of networks, ecosystems as galaxies of networks. And it makes it easier for employees to place bets on the future. It bets on many unknowns rather than predicting one right one. So it's kind of comfortable with ambiguity. But kind of a side issue of what Hire's done and its relationship with ecosystems is the trust involved. And it's interesting, when Hire, a Chinese company, looked at the American corporate world when it took over GE Appliances, what it saw was a very contractual focused culture. You had to have things written down and signed off. And Hire were actually uncomfortable with that, because they're more comfortable with a degree of ambiguity and vagueness. And I think you have to be in the world of ecosystems. You have to be comfortable with ambiguity and vagueness. And so I think what they've achieved is to move beyond kind of contractual, making business all about contracts. Annika referred to smart contracts as more free-flowing documents of agreement between people. But I think the trust is the big issue. And I think the winners of the future will be organizations such as Hire, which can create ecosystems built around trust. And I've spoken to the CEO of Hire, Jiang Rui Min, and I said, well, what happens when one of your micro enterprises, say they've got a brilliant idea. So there's a team of 10, leave Hire, pursue this idea, and it's really successful. I said, well, what happens then? What does Hire get part of the action? What's the agreement? And he said, well, it doesn't really matter about the contractual agreement isn't the big driver behind this. If they're successful, we'll be successful. We'll benefit from their success. And but there's nothing necessarily the agreement between them, you've got to accept, is a movable feast. So there's a strong element of trust, and I think that's what's missing in many the way we see the potential of ecosystems. That actually ecosystems can be very daunting. I mean, the McKinsey research I just quoted about hundreds of industries being collapsed down to be dominated by 12 huge organizations dominating is potentially frightening. So there's a very strange juxtaposition of frightening world domination and the actual trust and relationships which are necessary to make ecosystems work. It's kind of an ecosystem paradox, I think. But I think a company like Hire is really interesting because they have the humility to admit that their way might not be the best way, and to learn as they go along. And it's that openness to learning, I think, is at the heart of making ecosystems work.
Thanks, Stuart. But then, Sangeet, I have to come to you here. In fact, what Stuart was saying is there's a lot of difference in terms of like how companies are going to get operating on or whatever. But what about thinking? Like where do you think how talent will actually get focused on? You have really alluded to that point in terms of like how future of work is going to change. But how do you think ideas will really get implemented in organizations or thought through? In fact, I had a very interesting question. Like, in fact, it says, would the new organizational reality be for leaders to consider building divergent thinkers in their teams rather than convergent thinkers to achieve a quicker synthesis of minds and shorten the innovation cycle? So how do you really react to this idea?
Absolutely. So I'll take a shot at that, but I would love to hear Annika's view as well, because I know she's done a lot of work in this space. So here's how I think about it. And I'm just going to, start with what, a quote that Stuart mentioned from John Hagel, which is that we're going to have to go away from scalable efficiency to scalable learning, because traditional organizations in a world of low volatility, or where competitive environments were less volatile, technological forces were slow, traditional organizations were built for efficiency. So they required convergent thinkers. They required thinkers who would just get really good at doing one task and then repeat it on and on and on. And as the cycle of innovation and of volatility has hastened, that has changed. And we're at a point where learning is going to be the key competitive advantage that firms have. And I'll go back to another thing that Stuart mentioned, which is a really interesting point. Why is Tesla vertically integrating in a world that is going towards ecosystems? Now, what's important over here is that Tesla actually has created ecosystems where talent is not the key differentiator. So if you think of Tesla, it created a lot of patents on electric vehicles, on energy, and it open sourced all of those patents to actually create ecosystems by enabling innovation and commoditizing the underlying patents. Because the more the complements of the electric car increase, the more the value of the electric car will increase. So what we see over there is that there's going to be a massive part of things that traditionally were controlled by an organization, output like research, that would increasingly be commoditized. And instead, work or focus of talent will shift towards constantly learning and improving on the parts that really matter. So if you look at this, Tesla as an example, self-driving technology at this point is really still very far from being at maturity. And so when you are in that kind of in that phase of the curve, when learning is your key differentiating factor, you're better off aggregating divergent thinkers, a lot of talent inside your firm who can help you learn at a faster rate, creating those learning and collaboration spaces. Going back to what Annika was saying about innovation, fostering those right innovation networks and centralizing a lot of the learning within the firm. That is where a lot of competitive advantage would lie. And that is why where you are on that point of emergence in a technology where it has not reached maturity, you want to centralize all of that in the firm. And that to a large extent is what a company like Tesla does. So one of the key things that we'll see is we're going to see the need for divergent thinkers who can challenge the views of others and who can together help maximize the collective learning of a firm. At the same time, the other thing that's important to also call out over here is that, I'm just going to leave this as an open thought, is that not all professions, and hence not all professionals, are equally well suited towards exploiting thinking towards their professions. A lot of professions will increasingly get commoditized, and the Uber driver is the classic example of that. No amount of innovation over there, unless the innovation beats the algorithm, no amount of innovation helps you go beyond a certain level of output and a certain pay that you get out of it. So the reason that happens is because learning is not advantageous in an Uber driver setting. The more you drive as a London cabbie, the more you learn the city. But with the Uber map in front of you, that is commoditized. On the other hand, if you are on, say, a freelancing network like Upwork, the more 5-star ratings you get, the more challenging projects you get at a higher rate. And so the more your learning gets manifested in the rating. So what I'm trying to say is that not all professions will encourage divergent thinking. Not all professions will attract the same level of returns to learning, but the few that do, those organizations will have to rely on divergent thinkers.
Beautifully said, Sangeet. Anika, I have to come to you here. In fact, Sangeet said, as Sangeet said, you've done significant amount of work in this area. You've tried to understand the idea of work and how talent is really going to change. What are your views? How do you think things are really going to change in the future? And another point that comes to my mind is that are engineers going to be passe? Everybody's been so fascinated by this whole idea of engineers and everything. So in the next 10 years, as Sangeet is saying, will engineers be dead or engineering be dead as a profession? Is it going to be something else? Or is it going to be philosophers who are going to be taking over? Anika.
Oh my God, it's a very, very complex question. I would love to go back to one thing that was mentioned earlier before I tried to answer that more philosophical question. I think, so I've been studying the Silicon Valley companies like the Facebook and the Google and the Amazon and Netflix. And I think, companies from all over the world have been studying those companies and try to learn, not only because they have been establishing their platform business, become super successful in establishing the platform and be this aggregator, right? And they use the internet technology and software technology primarily to do that. So companies from all over the world, including industrial firms, have tried to learn, because those companies also are much more agile, more faster, have been showing innovation, an innovation rate that is enormously impressive. So they haven't just have a new business model, but they actually changed the whole management model on how to run the company as well. So the industrial firm have tried to learn. So to come to my point, what I think is so impressive with Haier in China is that they actually, if you think about it, they have combined both worlds. They are primarily and has been an industrial firm, and they are primarily hardware firm. So they would be more closer to the construction or life science or something else. And where you also have the typical R&D and hardware products that is going to be produced. But what they have took from the Silicon Valley companies, which is very interesting, is the whole idea of having and offering a platform and becoming an aggregator of demand. So they can do that, and then in the same time, they coordinate and they take a leading role to coordinate key players within industries, within their key strategic industries in ecosystem, through those platforms and smart contracts and other things. So they can combine what the Silicon Valley internet-based software companies have been doing with the industrial firm business model in a very smart way. And I think the key here, why they've done that, and what also the chairman is focusing on in Haier over and over again, is that you have to shift the focus from the product focus. So I'm not just delivering a machine, or I'm not just delivering a drug, but I'm serving a lifetime user. and I need to optimize this lifetime user value. And I need to do that by collaborating, and in the same time also then become more of a dominant player in a whole industry. And they take on the whole coordinator role, and they can do that with help of smart contracts, internet technology, and others, and by establishing the platform and learning from the Silicon Valley software companies. So they are actually converging in industry firm context with a software internet-based context. And in the same time, they have also been taking a number of ideas from those Silicon Valley companies like Google and others and Amazon, where you create this entrepreneurship at scale. And now we're coming to talents, right? Where I think the most important thing in the future, if you look at the Silicon Valley companies, for example, Google, that I studied for over a year, if you look at their recruitment criteria, it's primarily cognitive capabilities and leadership, and the fit with their value system, which they call Googliness, that stands for maybe 75% of the sort of the importance when they choose a person. And the professional knowledge that they are hired for, if it's a lawyer or an engineer or whatever, it stands for maybe 25%. And when I ask them, why is that, right? And this is connected to entrepreneurship as well at scale in the company. When I ask them, why do you do that? And why is all those other three factors standing for 75%, which might be 25% in any other industrial firm? They say, the pace is, the world is changing so much, and we need to have, coming back to this continuous learning, rapid learning. We need people that can rapidly learn. That is the most important thing. And that have showed us that they have the cognitive capability and the leadership to do that and take on a leadership role. Because no company that want to scale fast can rely on people that can take on a leadership role, right? And you need people like Google have 100,000 plus people that can run and make decisions like an army in Afghanistan that is disconnected from the central headquarters, right? They need to survive. They need to figure out what to do. You cannot have a command control anymore. You cannot have a few people on the top instructing you exactly what to do anymore. So I find that very interesting. So I would say, answering your specific question about talent, I do see that we need to be more and more skilled in software and engineering, and I try to push my own daughters to go into that field. But I do find that the cognitive capability, the leadership capability, the possibility to learn fast is maybe even more important. And those are skills that we need to add on to any business school or engineering school as well.
Thanks, Annika. In fact, I wanted to request you to ask a question to Stuart. Like, what do you think? If you want to put him in the corner, what is the question that you would like to ask, Stuart?
Well, I could pick up the final question from a question from Vijaya Devi. What are the preconditions for ecosystems to get created or evolve? And that relates, I think, to Annika's point. I think what we're looking at is a new set of managerial and leadership skills. And I think the starting point has got to be openness. I was talking to two academics from America recently about their notion of cooperative advantage. That was Leon Prieto and Simone Phipps, who've just written an article for MIT Sloan Management Review. And I think cooperative advantage is actually what we need to explore in the future. And the job of manager becomes creating, sustaining, and maximizing relationships. So I think the philosophers will take over. So the emphasis will be on team working, truly empowering people rather than just talking about it. Actually, the job of managers is setting people free rather than controlling them. And there'll be a premium on learning and curiosity. One noticeable thing about Hire is that the CEO, Jiang Min, is the most well-read CEO I've ever encountered. He's read all the management books. He's read philosophy. He's read psychology because he's interested. It's amazing how many CEOs I've met in the Western world, and they don't read books. So I think there'll be a premium on curiosity and learning, and also on skills like project management. I mean, project management is about gathering together a group of people with a clear short-term objective. And I think ecosystems lends itself to those skills. So I think that the first, we need to rethink, as Annika said, our notions of management and leadership in this new world, as Sangeet has mapped out, dominated by platforms and characterized by ecosystems.
Thanks, Stuart. In fact, I have to ask you one of the final questions as we move towards the closure of the session. Sangeet, there's a question from Prashant, who's a participant here with us today. How do you see ecosystems competing with each other? Will the network effect dominate, or are there more compelling alternate value drivers? What do you think?
Yeah, it's this is a fascinating area because it's changing every day, and it's changed a lot over the last 5 to 6 years. For instance, a lot of traditional or conventional wisdom around at least platforms was that platforms would with network effects end up with a winner take all kind of a scenario, and it becomes difficult for them to be unseated. And that, to a large extent, that's true when you're thinking about competition in a very linear way. When you're thinking about competing with Google using a search engine or competing with Facebook using a social network, then it's true. But when you're thinking about competition in a more lateral sense, when you start thinking about, let's talk about specifically 3 levers of competition over here. When you start thinking about first, as the first lever, what's the consumer job to be done? Are we are we doing a fundamentally different job and still acquiring the same commodity? For example, Instagram, the job that it does is different from Facebook, but it competes for the same time that users have. WhatsApp, Snapchat, all of them do, or TikTok, all of them do jobs that are different, but compete for the same time. So ultimately, are we competing for the same commodity but with a different job to be done? That's one lever on which you could unseat platforms with large ecosystems around themselves. A second way to unseat platforms is to infiltrate platforms and their ecosystems. And a very good example of that is a company called Stripe. Stripe is one of the largest payments companies today. And what it does really interestingly is it manages payments at the API level. And because it manages payments at the API level, it is able to manage payments for large platforms. So if you pay an Uber drive, if you pay Uber, Uber has to eventually settle that with the Uber driver. Now, what Stripe does is it aggregates all the payments on the consumer side and then runs the calculations and apportions all the payments on the merchant side. And through that, Stripe became a payment capability for many different platforms. And through that, eventually, it set up relationships. Going back to Stuart's point, it acquired the relationship with the merchant and removed the platform from the equation, or kind of created a layer between the platform and the merchant. So today, Stripe is in a unique position. It never started with an ecosystem. It never started with a platform play, but it's in a unique position where it's the one company that knows that you run a shop on Shopify by day and you drive a car on Lyft by night, because it's managing your payments in both places. And through that, it's now setting up its own ecosystem, which is where it's headed. So the second lever is that you can infiltrate a platform's ecosystem without having to directly compete with them. A third lever of competition, which is again lateral, so where again you can unseat the network effect, is that you compete with some of these user-facing ecosystems, some of these large aggregation platforms, by changing a standard in the industry, by changing something fundamentally at the back end. So this is beginning to happen in the healthcare industry, where Apple, for instance, is pushing for standards at the back end so that it can move the patient's personal health record away from Epic and Cerner into Apple as the place where the health record is managed. And through that, the health record becomes interoperable with different hospitals instead of being stuck with one. So that's a third way in which you compete with ecosystems. So As long as you choose one of those three levers, you have the ability to displace the network effect.
Thanks, Sangeet. In fact, Stuart, before we close the session, like one thing that you would like to tell corporations to do to be ready for the future?
I think there's a question on the right saying, give us some examples of not just Silicon Valley companies. And I think the thing with ecosystems is they are everywhere and they exist already. Think of any organization which has close relationships with its suppliers and its customers and is creating a context built on relationships. And I think that's the key takeaway for managers and leaders. They've got to build those relationships. And if they build those relationships, they are actually creating ecosystems, even though they might not think of them as that.
Annika, one last thing, one thing that you would like managers to do if they want to be competing in the future, being successful in the future, to run enterprises which are going to be effective and productive?
I think one thing that I would like to underline is or emphasize is that I find many companies are experimenting today. They are on experimental level regarding ecosystem, and I would like to see the whole question about how you can speed up and therefore become more competitive and survive long term by collaborating, and specifically new digital ecosystem where you usually are not as an industrial firm, to have that more on a board level and CEO level and discuss, a clear strategy for how to do it.
Mm-hmm. Sangeet, last word to you, 30 seconds. What do you think one thing managers should do?
I think I'll just reiterate what we've said quite a bit. The only competitive advantage as an organization that's going to matter is learning and the ability to translate learning into innovation. And we need to move away from the scalable efficiency model and move towards learning and innovation.
So I think this has just been a fascinating discussion. And one thing that I do take away is that there seems to be a challenge in the world, and that is that people are not reading enough. And even Stuart had actually said that there are CEOs who are not reading enough. So in the future, it is going to be about curiosity. It is going to be about learning. It's actually going to be about looking things from a different perspective. And that's what the world is going to be all about. So thanks a lot, all of you. Thanks, Annika. Thanks, Sangeet. Thanks, Stuart, for really joining us today for this very fascinating discussion. I think it was just wonderful to have you here today. And I would like to thank the participants as well. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, and be well and be safe.